He stood in the half-lit office, staring at the desk of the one person he'd never expected to lose. Her lamp was still on, casting a soft circle of gold across an empty chair, tilted, as if she'd almost sat down, then changed her mind. A sealed envelope waited on the keyboard, his name written in her careful handwriting, the ink steady where her heart clearly hadn't been. Outside, Chicago was waking in the cold blue of early morning, but in here, nothing felt alive. The quiet had weight, the kind that presses against a man's ribs and makes him admit things he's spent years pretending he didn't feel. He had built an empire on precision, certainty, control, yet one missing woman and one small letter had him standing there like the ground had shifted under him. How does a man who never says the wrong thing finally realize the one thing he never said was the only thing that mattered? If you've ever held on to someone a little too quietly, this story might feel familiar. Let's begin. The office floor was still dark when Ethan noticed her desk lamp glowing, but her chair was empty, turned slightly, as if she had nearly sat down and changed her mind. The faint hum of the heating vents filled the stillness, a thin ribbon of sound drifting through the long corridor of glass-walled offices. He paused at the threshold, one hand on the doorframe, unsure why the sight unsettled him. Marian was never late. In 6 years, she had beaten the sunrise more consistently than the birds perched along the river. A thin layer of frost clung to the window beside her desk, softening the view of downtown Chicago into pale streaks of silver. The storm from the night before had left snow piled along the sidewalks, but inside the building, the air felt too warm and too quiet, as if holding its breath. Ethan set his briefcase down, the click of the metal clasp echoing louder than it should have. He glanced at the clock, 6:12 she usually arrived at 6:00 sharp. His gaze drifted back to her chair. The fabric was still indented, the way it always was after a long day. A small ceramic mug sat beside the monitor, a faint ring of yesterday's herbal tea circling the bottom. The lamp's soft yellow glow cast a gentle halo over the desk, yet the space felt wrong, off-balanced, missing its center of gravity. Then he saw it, a sealed envelope placed neatly on the keyboard, his name written in her careful handwriting, Mr. Caldwell. He froze. His breath hitched in a way he didn't expect. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at the envelope as if it were something fragile or dangerous. The tightening in his chest surprised him. He told himself it could be anything: a note explaining she was out sick, a reminder about a meeting, a document needing his signature. But none of those required an envelope. None were left like this. He stepped closer. The leather of his shoes squeaked lightly against the polished floor. He reached for the envelope, but his hand stopped halfway, fingers trembling. He curled them into a fist and let it drop to his side. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. It didn't make sense that a simple piece of paper could stir something he had spent years keeping under lock and key. He prided himself on being steady, controlled, unshakable in a crisis. He had weathered market collapses, legal fires, and the loss of his father without letting anything show. Yet the silence in this room felt sharper than all of it. He forced a breath and glanced toward the hallway, half expecting to see her appear with that calm, composed expression of hers, a quick apology for running late, followed by the soft smile she rarely showed anyone else. But the corridor remained empty. Slowly, he lowered himself into her chair. The cushion was still warm. That detail broke something small inside him. He picked up the envelope at last. The paper was thick, the seal pressed firmly. There was nothing hurried about it. Whatever she had written, she had taken her time. He turned it over once, then again. The air around him seemed to close in, the edges of the room tightening. His thumb slipped under the flap. The sound of the paper tearing felt too loud, almost inappropriate in the quiet. He pulled the letter out, but before the first line fully came into view, a memory struck him so sudden, so sharp that he had to close his eyes. It was from last winter, a day he had pushed too hard, expected too much from everyone, especially her. He had ended the evening in his office, shoulders slumped, head in his hands. Marian had stepped in without knocking, carrying a cup of hot ginger tea. She didn't say a word. She simply set it down, adjusted the curtains so the wind wouldn't rattle them, and paused long enough that he felt a quiet steadiness settle back into his bones. He remembered thinking only for a split second that he didn't deserve that kind of care. His eyes opened again, pulled back into the present. The letter lay open in his hands, but he couldn't bring himself to read the first sentence. Something inside him resisted, as if reading it would make something final, permanent. He swallowed hard, the taste of bitter coffee still lingering from the drive over. The edges of the paper cut lightly into his fingertips. He forced his eyes downward. The letters blurred at first, refusing to come into focus. He blinked once, twice, but his chest tightened instead of easing. Why now, he murmured, his voice rough in the empty room. But the question wasn't really about timing. It was about everything he suddenly feared losing. The silence deepened around him, heavy and unforgiving. He leaned back slightly, exhaling a shaky breath. The city was waking outside, cars rolling over slush, office lights flickering alive, floor by floor, but none of it eased the cold weight settling in his stomach. His hand lowered the letter to his lap. He stared at the words without truly processing them yet. He wasn't ready. Not for this, not for what it meant. A faint tremor ran through him as he looked toward the door again. The lamp still glowed, warm and patient, illuminating the space she filled every morning with steady presence, the presence he had never once imagined being without. The thought came uninvited. Why does the idea of her leaving make him feel something he had spent years refusing to name? He didn't have an answer, not yet. And the letter waited. For 6 years. She had read him better than anyone else, even when he wished she wouldn't. Marian Brooks had a way of seeing through the noise of a day, of catching small shifts in Ethan's breath or tone before he ever said a word. It wasn't something she flaunted. It was just how she moved through life, quiet, observant, steady in a way that made messy men like Ethan feel a little less scattered. In the early days, people mistook her calmness for detachment. They didn't notice how she carried more weight than any department head, or how the rhythm of the entire floor subtly matched her pace. She never announced her presence when she walked into a room. She didn't need to. Papers arrived on time because she willed them to. Meetings stayed civil because she anticipated tension before it erupted. And Ethan got through his days because she thought 3 steps ahead of him. Always. She didn't speak much at work. She didn't have to. Her competence filled the silence. Every morning, she arrived before dawn, slipping out of her coat, smoothing her skirt, and arranging his briefings in a careful stack. She checked his calendar twice, then shifted a meeting here or moved a call there, shaping his day into something survivable. When crises erupted, and they always did, she handled them with a steady hand, never flinching. If she stayed late, no one heard her sigh. If she came in exhausted, no one saw it. She wore composure like armor. But the company didn't see her. Not really. She was respected. Yes, admired even, but in the way people admire a well-built bridge. Useful, dependable, taken for granted. Ethan noticed more than most, though even he didn't understand just how much of his life balanced on her shoulders. Outside the office, the world was smaller. The townhouse she rented on a quiet street in Oak Park was tidy, warm, and just a touch lonely. The photos on her walls were few, a picture of her mother, who'd passed too young, a snapshot from college when she'd still believed she'd travel the world, and an old Polaroid of her aging golden retriever, Max, now moving slowly through the last chapter of his life. Her evenings were quiet. She'd hang her coat by the door, feed Max, and warm leftover soup from the night before. Sometimes she played music, soft jazz, the kind her mother loved, but usually she let silence fill the rooms. The kind of silence that wrapped around her too easily. The kind that felt like both comfort and confinement. She wasn't unhappy. Not exactly. She simply lived in routines built over years of doing what was expected. Work, home, sleep, repeat. There was safety in that. Predictability. No sudden heartbreaks. No wild hopes to be disappointed by. Still, On some nights when Max snored softly at her feet and the streetlight outside flickered against her kitchen window, something inside her stirred, a restlessness she didn't have a name for, a wondering about the life she'd once imagined but somehow drifted away from. She'd sit at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea. The warmth felt good against her palms, especially on nights when the cold crept into her bones early. Her laptop screen glowed in front of her, illuminating the faint circles beneath her eyes. She didn't notice how tired she looked until moments like this, when the stillness left no distractions. On one such night, 2 weeks before she placed the envelope on Ethan's keyboard, she opened her email and saw the reminder waiting for her. Your application to Harbor Outreach is ready for final review. Her breath had caught then, just slightly. She'd sent the application late one night, in a moment of courage she barely recognized as her own. Harbor Outreach was a non-profit she had admired for years, an organization that helped families rebuild after hardship. She'd always told herself it was beyond her reach, too risky, too uncertain, too different from the world she'd built her life around. But something about that winter, about how her days blurred into endless schedules and her nights into soft loneliness, had nudged her into trying. She had filled out the form slowly, hands trembling a little as she listed her skills, her experience, the things she rarely allowed herself to claim out loud. And then she sent it. She didn't tell a soul. Seeing the reminder again now sent a ripple of warmth and fear through her. She clicked the email open. Her resume was attached. A message from the hiring committee rested below, waiting for her to confirm a virtual interview. She hovered her finger over the trackpad. The cursor blinked on the confirm button, steady and unyielding. Max lifted his head at her feet, his cloudy eyes turning toward her with that old, patient devotion. She reached down and scratched behind his ears, grateful for the grounding weight of his presence. A new life, a new chance, a new city, maybe. A job that wasn't defined by someone else's needs, but by purpose, by something she believed in. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of her tea seep into her hands. She imagined waking up without rushing to beat the sunrise. Imagined a space where her worth wasn't measured in how well she held someone else's world together. Imagine being seen not as indispensable, not as reliable, but as someone who wanted more. Yet the moment she imagined stepping away, a familiar pull tightened in her chest. Loyalty, obligation, and something else she didn't dare name. She opened her eyes again. The cursor still blinked, waiting. Her breath hitched. Why did she hesitate to click it? The question sat heavy in the quiet kitchen, lingering long after the tea had cooled. It happened in under 10 seconds, the kind of moment that rewrites the next 100 days. The glass-walled conference room buzzed with the low hum of tension that always came with quarterly reviews. Papers rustled, chairs scraped, and investors sat stiffly beneath the harsh fluorescent lights as the Chicago skyline brightened behind them. Ethan stood at the head of the table, shoulders squared, voice firm as he navigated through projections and restructuring plans. Marian slipped in quietly, placing a corrected packet in front of him. She didn't interrupt. She never did. She simply tapped once on the updated line revenue noted correctly. Projections adjusted. A small reminder. A lifeline. Really? Before he could thank her? A junior manager. Grant leaned forward, his tone sharper than it needed to be. That adjustment wasn't in the packet she sent me yesterday. It threw off my entire segment. I wasn't told about any change. Marian didn't flinch. I sent the revision at 9 last night. You confirmed receipt. Grant opened his mouth again, but not before several investors exchanged looks, sensing something brewing. Ethan felt the pressure rising. Too many eyes, too many expectations, too little patience left from a week that had already stretched him thin. Grant pushed a copy of his packet forward. Well, it wasn't clear. Someone should have checked. It should have been right the first time. Ethan snapped. The words cracked like a whip across the table. For a moment, the room froze. Even the heating vents seemed to go silent. Marian's posture didn't change, but something in her expression did, a subtle tightening around her eyes, a faint stillness that said more than any outburst could. She lowered her gaze to her notes, her pen poised above the page. He noticed because he always noticed that her fingers trembled just slightly. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a cold sheen over everything, including the space between them. Ethan felt the regret almost instantly, sharp and unwelcome. She had saved him from an embarrassing error, not caused one. She had done what she always did, catch what others missed. But the investors were watching, his leadership was on display, and he had chosen control over kindness. Marian slid the corrected packet toward an investor with her usual composure. "These are the accurate figures," she said softly. "The updated version was sent last night. No bitterness, no defense. Just professionalism with edges so smooth, it made the hurt that much more visible." Grant cleared his throat, shrinking into his seat. "My mistake," he muttered. Ethan continued the briefing, but he could barely hear his own voice. Every time he looked down at the pages, he saw the tremor in her hand instead. Every time he spoke, he felt the echo of the moment he couldn't take back. When the meeting finally wrapped, chairs scraped again, conversations resumed, and people filed out. Marian gathered her notes in silence, her face composed, unreadable. She stepped aside to let an investor pass and headed for the door. He caught up with her just outside the conference room. "Marian," he began, his voice lower than before. "That wasn't—" She turned slightly, enough to meet his eyes, but not enough for the conversation to feel private. Her expression was gentle, almost too controlled. "It's fine," she said. "It's not," he replied, but the words felt clumsy, late. She offered him the faintest nod. "We should prepare for the afternoon call. I'll update the deck and send it to you in an hour." Then she walked away polite, respectful, steady as always, but something in her distance stung more than any argument could have. He watched her go, a heaviness settling in his chest. She didn't rush, she didn't falter, yet her steps had a quiet finality to them, a small shift in rhythm he couldn't ignore. He told himself the moment would pass, like it always did. But a deeper part of him, a part he rarely allowed to speak, knew better. Back in his office, he sat down, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly. He could still see the fluorescent light flickering above her, still see the tremor in her fingers. He had put that there. He had added another weight to a woman already carrying too many. He leaned back slowly, staring at the ceiling. His throat tightened. Apologies were never his strength. Vulnerability, even less so. And admitting he relied on her and needed her felt too close to stepping off a ledge he wasn't ready for. But the memory of her turning away lingered like a bruise. Outside his glass office wall, he saw her pass by, a stack of files in her arms, her expression calm. She didn't look up. She didn't have to for him to feel the distance. He thought of the letter still tucked in his drawer, the unopened goodbye he had found on her empty desk, the possibility the threat of losing her. How many small humiliations could a loyal heart take before it stopped beating for someone he didn't want to know the answer? And yet, the question followed him long after she disappeared down the hall. The call came while she was folding a blanket, the radio low, the house quiet, a life too small for the woman she'd once dreamed of becoming. Snow pressed against the windows in soft, uneven patches, muting the neighborhood into stillness. Marian paused, holding the blanket to her chest as her phone buzzed on the counter. She almost didn't answer. Numbers she didn't recognize rarely brought good news, but something in instinct she wasn't used to trusting nudged her to swipe the screen. "Ms. Brooks, this is Ellen from Harbor Outreach." Her breath caught. She set the blanket down, smoothing the fabric with shaking hands. "We're pleased to offer you the position," the woman continued, her voice warm and sure. "Director of Senior Tech Initiatives. Your background is a rare fit. We would be thrilled to have you." The words settled around her like falling snow soft. Quiet, unbelievable. The position wasn't glamorous. It didn't pay what corporate life did. But it mattered. It gave older adults the tools to navigate a world that had outpaced them. It gave people dignity, independence, connection. Things Marian valued more than she ever admitted. She sank into the nearest chair, gripping the edge of the table as if the earth had shifted. The radio hummed softly in the background, an old Ella Fitzgerald song she'd always loved. For a moment, she felt suspended between two versions of herself, the woman she was and the woman she still wanted to be. Ellen explained the benefits, the expectations, the flexible schedule. Marian heard the words, but her pulse drowned most of them out. When the call ended, she placed the phone gently on the table. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling. She stood and walked to the living room. Max lifted his head from his bed in the corner, tail thumping once in a sleepy greeting. She knelt beside him, brushing her fingers through his fur. His warm presence grounded her. "A new job," she murmured, barely above a whisper. "Can you believe that—" His eyes blinked slowly, patient and trusting. She sat back on her heels, looking around her small townhouse as if seeing it for the first time. The lamplight glowed in pumpkin-colored pools on the hardwood floor. Shadows stretched long and gentle across the walls, shifting with the flicker of the bulb. Everything felt familiar, and suddenly too narrow. She imagined mornings without rushing. She imagined evenings spent building something meaningful instead of patching together the frayed edges of someone else's empire. She imagined breathing easier, sleeping better, feeling being needed for reasons that aligned with her heart. But as soon as hope swelled in her chest, a quiet ache followed. Ethan. She didn't try to explain it, even internally. The thought alone tightened something behind her ribs. Leaving the job meant leaving him, leaving the rhythm they'd built, the trust, the small nonverbal conversations that carried them through long days, leaving the quiet ways he relied on her, even when he didn't say it. She sat at her kitchen table, pulling her laptop toward her. The screen's pale glow washed over her face, soft but unforgiving. The job offer rested in her inbox. The subject line, bold, formal offer director of senior tech initiatives. She clicked it open again. She read every word, twice. Then she opened a new document. Her fingers hovered over the keys before moving slowly, deliberately. "Dear Mr. Caldwell," she typed. Her stomach tightened as the letters formed. She paused, then continued. "I am submitting my resignation. Effective." Her breath faltered. She glanced toward the living room, where Max slept again, curled into himself. The shadows on the wall shifted, lengthening as the lamplight flickered. She looked back at the screen. Resignation. The word felt like both freedom and fracture. She reread the first sentence, feeling her heartbeat climb into her throat. She imagined handing him the letter. She imagined his expression controlled, unreadable. She imagined walking away from the office she had held together for years. Walking away from the man who had unknowingly become the quiet axis of her days. Her vision blurred for a moment. She blinked it away. A new life waited, a purposeful life, a life that might fill the hollow spaces she didn't acknowledge often enough. Still, when she looked at those typed words, something inside her recoiled. With a shaky exhale, she selected the entire paragraph and pressed delete. The screen went blank. She stared at it, a physical ache settling behind her sternum. Her hands pressed against her forehead as she tried to steady her breath. Why did choosing herself feel like betrayal? Why did the possibility of walking away from him hurt as much as staying? Her eyes drifted again to the empty document, bright, waiting, unjudging. She closed the laptop slowly, as if afraid any sudden movement would shatter her. The house remained quiet around her, too quiet, and she knew she couldn't sit in this in-between space forever. But tonight, she couldn't take a single step either direction. He noticed it in the silence long before he noticed it in her eyes. The small pauses between their morning exchanges stretched wider, like threads pulled too tight. She still greeted him with the same polite tone, but the softness beneath it once effortless. Once his unspoken anchor had thinned. Ethan felt it even in the way she handed him his schedule. Now not with the familiar, grounded certainty, but with a gentle formality that made the papers feel colder. She no longer paused at his door to ask if he needed anything else, no longer reminded him to eat or placed a cup of ginger tea beside his monitor during long afternoons. And the quiet moments that once eased him through impossible days, those soft exchanges in the early morning before the building filled, were gone. She was present, efficient, professional, but her warmth had vanished, as if she'd tucked it away somewhere he couldn't reach. He hadn't realized how much he depended on that warmth until it disappeared. On Wednesday, the office buzzed with its usual midday energy, footsteps echoing across the polished floors, phones ringing down the hall. Ethan stepped out of a meeting and glanced toward her desk. She wasn't there. Her chair, usually pulled close, sat angled slightly away from the desk, a subtle sign she'd left in a hurry. Something unsettled him. He checked the time. Lunch hour. He didn't normally track her schedule, not consciously. She had always been predictable in her routines, grounding in her consistency. But today, he found himself searching the floor for her, scanning the conference rooms as if drawn by a quiet desperation he couldn't explain. He finally spotted her through the glass wall of the cafeteria. She sat across from a man he didn't recognize, at first dark blue sweater, sleeves pushed to his elbows, lines around his eyes that spoke of loss and resilience. Then it clicked. Daniel Rivers, a widower, a longtime friend of hers, someone she'd mentioned once, briefly, on a long night at the office 2 years ago. She'd spoken of him with fondness, a softness that Ethan had felt without understanding. Daniel leaned in as he spoke, his expression open, warm. Marian laughed at something he said, an easy, unguarded laugh Ethan hadn't heard from her in weeks. It landed in him like something physical. He stood there, just inside the hall, watching them through the reflection-soaked glass, his own faint silhouette layered over theirs, like an intrusive shadow. The sight tightened his chest unexpectedly, a strange mixture of confusion and something sharper. He tried to rationalize it. She was allowed to have friends, allowed to laugh, allowed to have a life outside of their long, interwoven work days. But the thought didn't soothe him. He watched her tilt her head, smiling as Daniel spoke again. Her shoulders relaxed, her eyes softened, her hands animated in a way he rarely saw at the office anymore. She looked like someone exhaling after holding her breath too long. His throat tightened. He had no right to feel anything at all. She wasn't his. She never had been. She wasn't obligated to pour warmth into his life simply because he'd grown used to receiving it. Yet the distance she'd created now felt like a cold gust sweeping through a door he hadn't realized was open. She hadn't been avoiding him. Not exactly. She just wasn't reaching for him anymore. And he didn't understand why that hurt. A group of employees passed behind him, chattering about weekend plans. Ethan forced himself to step away from the glass, but he only moved a few feet before turning back. He felt ridiculous standing there. Yet, he couldn't walk away. He watched Daniel lift his cup toward Marian, a small toast between old friends. She smiled again, softer this time, her eyes dropping shyly. Something inside Ethan twisted a feeling that didn't belong in a boardroom, in a corner office, in the walls of a company he had built. Jealousy. The word hit him with a quiet thud. He didn't want to name it. He didn't want to acknowledge the ache it carried with it. But the feeling lodged itself beneath his ribs, refusing to be reasoned away. When the two of them stood to leave, he stepped farther back from the glass, as if caught in something he shouldn't see. Daniel walked beside her, his hand brushing lightly against her arm as they talked. It wasn't intimate, not in any obvious way, but it was familiar, comfortable. Ethan's jaw tightened. They walked past the glass wall, unaware of him, and he watched the distance between them shrink with each step. Marian held her coat draped over one arm, Daniel gesturing warmly as he spoke. She looked different, lighter, seen. He realized with a slow, sinking ache that he hadn't made her look that way in a long time. He returned to his office, shutting the door more quietly than usual. The room felt different, emptier. He sat down but didn't reach for his laptop, didn't reach for the reports waiting for review. His hands lay still on his knees as he stared toward the hallway, replaying the image of her, laughing. Minutes later, a soft knock sounded at his door. He straightened instinctively. Marian stepped inside, holding a folder. "Here's the updated vendor contract," she said, her tone even polite. "Let me know if you need anything clarified. Who were you having lunch with?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. She blinked, surprised but not rattled. "Daniel? An old friend?" He nodded too quickly. "Right? Of course." She gave a small, courteous smile. Not the kind she used to give him, the one that softened her whole face, but something more professional, distant. Then she turned to leave. At the threshold, Daniel appeared behind her, pausing as he held the door for someone down the hall. He looked toward her and said, "Thanks for finally thinking about yourself for once." Ethan's breath stilled. Marian's cheeks warmed, her eyes dropping to the floor for just a moment. "I'm trying," she said quietly. Daniel smiled at her, gentle and encouraging, before walking away. Ethan didn't move, not until she disappeared down the hall with the folder still in her hand. The silence in his office felt heavier now, pressing against him like an unwelcome truth. Why did he suddenly fear he'd already lost her? He didn't realize how dark his office was until he finally lifted his head and noticed the city shimmering against the glass. The lights of downtown Chicago flickered like scattered embers, each one pulsing gently against the wide windows of the 27th floor. His desk lamp was off. The hallway lights had dimmed. Only the distant glow of traffic climbed up the building, casting faint reflections along the polished floor. He had been sitting there for hours. The photograph in his hands felt heavier the longer he stared at it. It was the same frame he rarely touched, wooden edges smoothed by time, a thin crack in the corner from a move years ago. The picture inside showed him and his father standing beside the first Caldwell freight truck, long before the company became the giant it was now. His father's hand rested proudly on his shoulder, and Ethan's smile, unrestrained and younger, looked foreign to him now. He didn't remember pulling the photo out of the drawer. He only realized he'd done it when he saw the frame resting against his knee, his thumb rubbing absent-mindedly across his father's faded shirt collar. She had been the one who placed it there years ago. He could still hear her voice from that afternoon after the funeral, the softness of it, the certainty. "You should keep this where you can see it," she'd said, setting the frame gently on his desk while he pretended to read a document he wasn't really seeing. "Not to make you sad, just to remind you that you weren't alone then, and you're not alone now." He hadn't responded. He hadn't been capable of much then, but she had stayed, steady and quiet, making sure food appeared near his desk, making sure meetings were rescheduled, making sure he had space to grieve without falling apart entirely. She had been the one who held him together when he didn't know how to hold himself. And now, tonight, her absence pressed against him in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The leather sighed beneath him. Outside, a gust of wind brushed against the windows, rattling faintly like distant whispers of a life he'd spent too long ignoring. Marian had left hours ago. She'd stopped by his office before heading out, asking if he needed anything else. He'd said no without looking up, too tangled in his thoughts to notice the tiredness in her voice or the way she lingered for a moment before walking away. When he finally checked the time, the office floor had already emptied, and the quiet stretched with an almost physical weight. Now, sitting alone in the dimness, he finally felt the full impact of the empty hallway outside his door. He set the photo down slowly, letting it rest against a stack of documents he hadn't touched. His fingers lingered on the frame before pulling away, as if releasing something fragile. The shadows shifted across the picture as the wind nudged the city lights. They shimmered along the glass, catching the edge of his father's smile. He swallowed hard. She had seen him vulnerable in ways no one else ever had. She had stayed steady when he was fractured. She had known the right words when he had none. She had cared not because it was her job, but because of who she was. And what had he given her in return? Long hours. Weight that wasn't hers to carry. Expectations dressed up as routine. silence when she needed acknowledgement, sharp words in front of others. And recently, distance he didn't understand himself. He ran his hand down his face, the quiet settling deeper into the room, into him. There was an ache there, regret, sharp and familiar. But beneath it was something heavier, something he'd spent months, maybe years, avoiding. He wondered whether he ever deserved her loyalty, or her gentleness, or the warmth she offered without asking for anything back. Tonight, it felt impossible to pretend he hadn't noticed how she'd stopped offering it. He stood up and walked to the window, pressing his palm lightly against the cool glass. The city sprawled beneath him, alive and indifferent. He watched a line of headlights move along the highway, each one belonging to someone heading home, someone who had someone to go home to. He wasn't sure when home had stopped being a place and started being a person. His reflection hovered faintly in the glass lines carved deeper into his face than he remembered, shoulders stiff from years of holding too much. He didn't look like the man in the photograph anymore. He didn't look like the man she believed him capable of being. He returned to his desk and sank back into the chair, the fatigue settling into his bones. The silence felt like a confession, waiting to be spoken. Her name rose in his chest before he could stop it. "Marian," he whispered into the empty room. The sound barely broke the quiet. It wasn't meant to. It wasn't for anyone to hear. But the moment the name left his mouth, something inside him shifted, something he'd been pushing down for far too long. He closed his eyes, letting the truth press against him like a tide he couldn't hold back anymore. The loneliness in the room thickened, hollow and heavy, and the realization of how much he needed her presence settled deeper into his chest. He had never said her name like that before. Not when she was here, not when she could hear it. Only now, when she couldn't. Why was it easier to say it to an empty room than to her? The letter lay beside her keyboard, her handwriting steady in form, but trembling in truth. The overhead lamp cast a warm circle of light around the desk, softening the edges of the office that had come to feel like an extension of her own home. For a moment, Marian simply stared at the envelope, the curves of her cursive rising and falling like small breaths she couldn't quite catch. Her name, her address, her polite closing, everything about the letter was composed, almost graceful. But inside it was the first honest thing she'd allowed herself to say in years. She rested her palms on the desk, letting the silence settle around her. The building had emptied long ago, leaving only the low hum of heating vents and the distant creak of settling metal high in the structure. She knew this place too well, the way the lights dimmed after 9, the way the elevator chimed softly during its overnight cycles, the way Ethan's door stayed open just enough that she could hear if he needed something. Tonight, that door was closed, and she was grateful. This wasn't a moment she wanted anyone to witness. She sat down slowly, smoothing the letter with the back of her fingers before picking up her pen again. She'd rewritten the opening paragraph 4 times already, trying to strike a balance between gratitude and truth. But the truth was weighty, tangled, not something that fit neatly inside corporate courtesy. She wasn't leaving because she was unhappy with the work. She wasn't leaving because she felt underappreciated. She wasn't leaving because the nonprofit paid well, because it didn't. She was leaving because loving someone in silence had begun to cost her pieces of herself. She rested the pen against her lips, her eyes burning with a dull ache. The choice felt both inevitable and unbearable. Carefully, she placed the letter under her keyboard, the safest place. She thought, tomorrow, she would talk to him face to face. She owed him that much. 6 years beside someone deserved more than an envelope left in the quiet. But she didn't know how to tell him that staying had become a slow erosion of her own life. She turned off the lamp with a soft click, leaving only the faint glow from the emergency lights reflecting off the polished surface of her desk. The darkness felt kinder, less exposing. She lingered a moment longer, fingertips grazing the edge of her keyboard, a silent goodbye to a routine that had shaped her days. Her phone buzzed suddenly, slicing through the stillness. She fumbled for it, startled by the sharp vibration. It was her sister, Lila. At this hour, it could only be something serious. Marian Lila's voice was breathless, tight. I'm sorry to call so late. My blood pressure. It spiked again. I'm at the ER. Marian's heart dropped. Are you alone? Did the doctors say they're running tests? I didn't know who else to call. I'm coming, Marian said instantly, already grabbing her coat from the back of her chair. She didn't bother shutting down her computer, didn't check the files scattered across her desk. She only paused long enough to make sure she had her keys before rushing toward the elevators. The building felt too big suddenly, every hallway stretching longer than usual, as if trying to hold her in place. The elevator arrived with a slow hum. As she stepped in, she realized she hadn't gone back for the letter. It was still under her keyboard, untouched, unread, but she would return in the morning. She would talk to Ethan then. She would explain everything, her reasons, her hopes, her fears. She would do it properly. She wouldn't slip away without a word like someone running from a life she regretted. She pressed the button for the lobby. Breath unsteady. The elevator doors closed on the 27th floor. The office remained still. Her desk lamp remained dark. And beneath her keyboard, the letter sat in silence, waiting for a morning that would not look the way she expected. The night air was cold when she stepped outside. She pulled her coat tighter, rushing toward her car. The wind stung her cheeks as she started the engine and backed out into the quiet streets. Her thoughts scattered between worry for her sister and the tightness she felt at leaving her desk in such a state of finality. She had always imagined her last night there would feel different, softer. Maybe, or more certain. But most endings didn't arrive with clarity. They arrived like this. She supposed unfinished, hurried, pulled in the direction of something more urgent. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights hurt her eyes. She found Lila lying on a narrow bed, one hand pressed to her temple, the other gripping the blanket like it anchored her. Relief washed over Marian as she took the chair beside her. "You shouldn't have driven alone," Marian murmured, brushing a wisp of hair away from her sister's face. "I didn't want to worry you," Lila whispered. "You always worry me." Marian forced a small smile. "But I'm here." And she was, fully, completely. No split attention, no checking her phone in case Ethan needed something. No running mental lists of the next day's schedule. Just here, with someone she loved, openly and without fear. They spoke quietly until the nurse came in, then fell into a soft silence when Lila began to drift off. Marian adjusted the blanket around her and leaned back in the chair, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. Her mind drifted, unbidden, back to the office, to the letter, to the way she hadn't given herself the chance to say the words out loud. She never wanted to leave without telling him why. The thought tightened her chest. She wouldn't do that to him, or to herself. She would go back in the morning and speak to him clearly. She owed their years of loyalty that much. But as she sat there under the dim hospital lights, fingers curled around the strap of her purse, a quiet fear crept into her. What if the letter wasn't hers to control anymore? What if the wrong person read the right words at precisely the wrong time? The envelope was so light he barely felt its weight. Yet the moment Ethan unfolded the letter, the air seemed to thicken around him. The sunlight creeping in from the east side windows cast a long, deliberate line across the floor, inching toward his shoes, as if time itself refused to wait for him to breathe. Her handwriting was familiar, steady, gracious. The same script she used for every board memo she ever signed. But here, on this paper, it carried a different charge. He read the first line once, then again, his eyes dragging over the words as if they might change if he stared hard enough. "Dear Ethan, I am grateful for the years here. Grateful. Years." His throat tightened. He kept reading. "But I believe it's time for me to step into a role where I can grow, where my contributions aren't tied entirely to someone else's needs. Someone else? His needs." He blinked as though the room had suddenly gone off balance. The hum of the heating vent felt louder, sharper, almost intrusive. She wasn't sick. She wasn't late. She was leaving. He lowered the paper, staring at the empty space around her desk, the chair, still slightly angled as if waiting for her, the cup she used for tea, the small plant she watered every Thursday. It all felt unbearably still, like a photograph left behind after someone has moved on. He forced himself to read the letter again, this time catching the subtle coldness buried between its careful lines. Not cruel. Never that. Marian wasn't capable of cruelty. But there was a kind of distance in the phrasing, an emotional finality he had never imagined would be directed at him. She wrote as though he no longer had a place in her life. His fingers tightened on the page. He could feel panic creeping in, a rare, unwelcome sensation he hadn't felt since standing beside his father's hospital bed nearly a decade ago. He had built his life on control, composure, logic. But this was something he didn't know how to brace for. He sank into her chair, the leather still faintly warm. The scent of her lavender hand lotion clung to the armrests. He leaned forward, elbows braced on his knees, the paper trembling between his hands. Why hadn't she told him? Why hadn't he seen it? Because he hadn't been looking. Because he had assumed she would always be there. Because he had taken her steadiness as certainty, her loyalty as permanence. His gaze fell to one line near the end of the page. I need to remember who I was before I spent so many years being whatever was needed of me. He read it again. Then again. The words struck deeper with each pass. She didn't feel seen. She didn't feel valued. Not by him. A soft exhale escaped him. Something close to a groan. He rested the letter on his knee and raked a hand through his hair. He had driven her away. The realization landed with a force that made his chest ache. The arguments in that boardroom, the distance creeping into her voice, the way she had stopped making ginger tea, the way she'd smiled at Daniel with an ease she no longer offered him. He had noticed all of it, but he hadn't asked. He hadn't said anything that mattered. He lifted the letter again, scanning the final paragraph. I hope the transition will be smooth. I will prepare all necessary documentation for whoever takes my place. The word place stung, as if she were removable, replaceable. His jaw clenched so hard it hurt. Her place wasn't just behind his desk. It wasn't in his schedule or his meetings or his polished professional routine. Her place was in the quiet moments of his life. Her laugh in the Catskills, her steadying presence at his father's funeral, the tea she brought him when tension curled between his shoulders, the way she said his name when the world around him felt like it was caving in. He didn't just rely on her. He needed her. He swallowed, the truth rising like something too long buried. She meant more to him than anyone had in years, and he had never said a single word to let her know. He felt his throat tighten as he whispered, barely audible, I can't lose her. The confession slipped out before he could stop it. He sat back, stunned by the sound of his own voice in the empty room, fragile in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be since childhood. But the truth was undeniable now. He didn't want a new assistant. He didn't want a clean transition. He didn't want efficiency or professionalism or a smooth handover. He wanted her. Just her. The realization left him breathless. His gaze drifted across her desk again, her pen, her notepad, the soft sweater she sometimes draped over the back of her chair. Everything felt wrong without her. He felt wrong without her. He stared at the letter again, heart pounding. If she was willing to leave him without a conversation, if she felt this unseen, if she had already chosen a different life, did he deserve the chance to fix what he had broken? The question landed heavy in the stillness, stretching between him and the letter like a fragile thread ready to snap. He left the building without his coat, something he had never done in 8 years as CEO. The cold January air slapped against his shirt the moment he stepped outside, but he barely felt it. Chicago's wind could have torn right through him, and he still wouldn't have slowed. The letter was crumpled in his hand, the paper softening from the tightness of his grip. He didn't bother calling his driver. He jogged down the steps and waved for a cab, something he hadn't done since before he'd taken the corner office. A yellow sedan jerked to a stop, and he yanked the back door open. "North side," he said. "Fast as you can." The driver gave a low whistle. "Buddy, it's rush hour. Please," Ethan added, surprising even himself. He wasn't used to pleading, but nothing about this morning fit the man he had been the day before. The cab lunged into traffic. Ethan stared at the city flashing by, buildings and sidewalks blurring into streaks of gray and steel. His chest tightened each time he replayed that line in her letter. "I need to remember who I was before." It wasn't the words that haunted him. It was the quiet ache behind them, the truth he had ignored for too long. He reached her street in under 20 minutes. He didn't wait for his change. He sprinted toward her townhouse, feet pounding the pavement, breath visible in the icy air. When he reached her door, he knocked hard enough for his knuckles to sting. "Marian," he called. "It's me. Please just open the door." Silence. He stepped back, heart hammering. Her curtains were drawn. The porch light was off. He walked around the side gate, peered through the kitchen window. Empty. No tea mug, no coat draped over a chair, no soft glow from a lamp she always kept on. Panic caught the back of his throat. He checked his phone. No messages, no calls. He opened his contacts. His thumb hovered over her name. He had called her thousands of times over the years for schedules, for meetings, for emergencies, but calling her now felt different, too personal, too raw. Still, he pressed the button. One ring, two, then her voicemail. He ended the call before the tone sounded. Hearing her voice on a recording was worse than silence. He pulled in a shaky breath and tried to think. Marian never disappeared. She didn't cancel without notice. She didn't leave things unresolved. If she wasn't at home, he hurried back toward the street and flagged down another cab. "Downtown," he said. "The non-profit tech center on Monroe." The driver nodded, and the car pulled away. Ethan tapped his fingers restlessly on his knee. He replayed the last week the way she'd been distant, tired, carrying something he had been too blind to see. He'd brushed it off as stress, normal stress, the kind she always handled without complaint. But now he wondered, had she been hurting? Had she been preparing to leave long before she put pen to paper? Traffic crawled. He craned his neck, willing the buildings to move faster. When he finally reached the center, he rushed inside, breath shallow, tie askew. A young receptionist looked up from her desk. "Hi, can I help Marian Brooks?" he said. "Has she checked in today?" The receptionist typed quickly. "No, sir. She isn't scheduled to start until next month." His stomach dropped. "Are you sure?" "Yes." She offered a polite, practiced smile. "She's not here." He thanked her, though he barely heard his own voice. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, melting the moment they touched the ground. He pressed his hands against his face for a moment, trying to steady his breath. Where would she go? He checked her calendar again. Empty except for the cryptic note she'd left him, transition planning. It felt like a farewell masked as efficiency. He typed a message but deleted it. Typed again, deleted it again. Words felt useless, too thin for everything he needed to say. He opened his Ride app and hesitated. Then he scrolled through her contacts in his phone, looking for anyone who might know something. One name stood out: her sister, Grace. His pulse surged. He called. Grace answered on the second ring, voice tense. "Ethan, yes," he said, exhaling. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm trying to reach Marian. Is she with you?" A brief silence. Then, "We're at St. Joseph's." His heart lurched. "Is she—" "It's me." Grace cut in, softening. "My blood pressure spiked this morning. She rushed here to help. She's been with me since 6 He closed his eyes, the relief sharp enough to sting. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'm on my way." The hospital was 10 minutes away, but the ride felt longer. By the time he stepped through the sliding glass doors, the smell of antiseptic hit him hard. He hadn't been inside a hospital since his father died. The fluorescent lights washed everything in a sterile glow, and the echo of hurried footsteps tightened something in his chest. He followed Grace's directions: second floor, west wing, family waiting area. He passed nurses pushing carts, a doctor murmuring to an elderly couple, the soft murmur of televisions humming above the hall. His breath quickened. He turned a corner, letter still clenched in his fist, and there she was. Marian sat alone on a bench near the window, hands folded in her lap, her coat still on, her posture tired in a way he had never seen. The deep winter light filtered through the glass behind her, brushing her hair with a pale silver outline. For a moment, he didn't move. Everything he wanted to say pressed against his ribs, aching for release. But he stayed still, afraid of frightening her, afraid she'd stand and walk away before he even reached her. He took one step, then another. She didn't look up, and he wondered with a throb he could barely withstand if she would even want to see him when she did. Her shoulders stiffened the moment she saw him, just the slightest lift, the faintest catch of breath, but enough for Ethan to feel it like a hand closing around his ribs. She didn't turn away. She didn't rise. She simply braced, as if preparing herself for something she wasn't sure she could bear. He approached slowly, unsure whether to speak her name or stay silent. The bench creaked softly as he eased down beside her, leaving just enough space to give her room, but not enough to pretend he wasn't reaching for her in every unspoken way. "Marian," he said quietly. She kept her eyes fixed on the window. Outside, gray winter light slid across the parking lot, reflecting off patches of old snow. A nurse rolled a cart past them, the wheels squeaking once before fading into the hallway. He wasn't sure where to begin. His voice felt clumsy in his throat. I got your letter." Her fingers tightened around each other, but she didn't respond. "I should have seen this coming," he continued, his tone low, "but I didn't. I didn't because I didn't want to believe you'd ever walk away from me." An intake of breath, barely audible. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "That letter, it hurt, more than I knew anything could. Not because you're leaving the company, but because it made me realize what I've done to you, what I didn't do." She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them with slow deliberateness. "Ethan," she murmured, "you don't owe me an explanation." "I do," he said. "I owe you more than one." The hallway hummed with distant footsteps, but the world between them felt painfully still. "I depended on you," he said, "not just professionally, not just for the schedule, or the meetings, or the 1,000 ways you kept my life upright. I depended on your steadiness, your presence." His voice cracked, more than I ever admitted, even to myself. Her jaw tightened, and she looked down at her hands, thumbs brushing the crease of her coat. "I was afraid," Ethan went on, the words trembling loose. "Afraid to need you, afraid to feel something that didn't fit inside the lines I've drawn around my life. And the more I felt, the quieter I became." He let out a breath that shook. "And you paid the price for that." Marian swallowed. For the first time since he'd sat down, she looked at him. Her eyes were damp, rimmed in exhaustion and something older than the morning, something that had been building for years. "You waited," she whispered, "until after I walked away?" He absorbed the words, each one sinking like a weight into his chest. "I know," he said, "and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every moment I made you feel invisible, for every time I took from you and gave nothing back." She blinked quickly, a tear slipping down before she could catch it. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, a gesture that hurt him more than her silence. "You were kind to me," she said softly. "You were thoughtful, in your own way. But kindness isn't the same as being seen. And I got tired of trying to convince myself it was enough." He felt his breath stall. "You kept your distance," she went on, "and I kept filling in the gaps, telling myself you cared, that you would say something when you were ready, but years went by. Ethan, years." Her voice trembled but didn't break. I stopped recognizing the woman I was waiting for. Outside the window, A gust of cold wind pushed a swirl of dry leaves across the concrete, their movements fragile and restless, like two lives circling each other for far too long. He reached for her hand, but stopped halfway, fingers hanging in uncertain space. Marian, his voice faltered. I love you. I don't know when it started. Maybe the day my father died, maybe earlier, but it's real, and it's been real for a long time. Her eyes softened, but her posture stayed guarded. Love isn't supposed to be a secret someone has to dig for. He closed his hand slowly, letting it fall to his lap. You deserved honesty, he said. You deserved more than what I gave you, and I don't expect you to forget that. She stared ahead, watching a patient in a wheelchair being pushed outside, a blanket draped over their legs, the hallway filled with the quiet hum of life continuing around them, indifferent to the moment unraveling on a simple wooden bench. I need time, she said finally. I need myself. I need to remember who I am without being attached to you. He nodded, not because it didn't gut him, but because it was true, and the job he asked quietly, the new life you're building. She hesitated, her breath fogging the cold window. I need to go. At least for now. The words hit harder than the letter had, but still. He didn't reach for her. He didn't beg. He didn't try to fold her back into the world that had kept her small. He simply nodded once, the movement slow, waited. If time is what you need, he said, then I'll give you all of it. Another tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it, but she didn't run. She didn't stand. She just whispered. I don't know if confession erases everything. His heart squeezed painfully. I know, he murmured, but I had to try. For a long moment, they sat together in silence, two people who had finally told the truth, but were still standing on opposite sides of a cracked bridge. Outside, the wind stirred again, and he wondered achingly whether a truth spoken too late could ever be enough to find their way back. The silence after heartbreak was not empty. Marian learned that sooner than she expected. It filled itself with new sounds, soft ones, gentle ones, the click of a tablet case opening, the warbled laughter of an 80-year-old man discovering he could email his granddaughter, the hum of a coffee pot in the small break room of the non-profit that had taken her in like a tired traveler. She arrived early that first Monday, breath fogging in the crisp morning as she unlocked the glass door. Inside, the lights flickered on, one by one, casting long, warm stripes across the floor. The space was modest secondhand chairs, mismatched tables, posters encouraging digital literacy. But it felt human, less polished, more alive. She hung her coat on a hook and stood for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her chest. It didn't hurt. This quiet. Not like the one that had lived in Ethan's office, the one she'd carried home night after night. Here, silence meant possibility. By mid-morning, she guided Mrs. Halpern, a bright-eyed widow with a tremor in her hands, through the basics of using a tablet. No rush, Marian murmured, steadying the woman's fingers with her own. We'll do this together. Warm lamplight touched the edges of their hands. When the screen finally responded and the letter H appeared in the search bar, Mrs. Halpern let out a triumphant breath. Oh my, she whispered. I haven't learned something new in years. Marian smiled, a real one, not the polite curve she had worn for so long. Feels good, doesn't it? She said. It feels like waking up. The older woman replied. Something inside Marian stirred faint, but unmistakable. She recognized that feeling. She had been asleep too. Between sessions, she checked her phone, not intentionally, just a habit that hadn't died yet. When she did, she found a new email, short, no signature line, no pressure, no request. I hope your first day is going well. Take good care, E. She read it once, then again. There was no apology tucked between the lines, no attempt to sway her, just a simple kindness. Thoughtful, quiet, unlike the man she used to know and painfully like the man he had been becoming near the end. She locked her phone and slipped it into her pocket. Later, during lunch, she sat by the window of the break room with a thermos of soup. Outside, bare branches scratched softly against the glass when the wind picked up. She watched them sway, watched their resilience against the cold, and wondered if emotional winters worked the same way if people regrew slowly, quietly, from the inside out. Her phone buzzed again. Another email. Not from Ethan this time, but from the head of her new department. A schedule update. Still, her heart had given a tiny leap before she checked the sender. She sighed, surprised at her own disappointment. That afternoon, she helped a retired teacher navigate an online doctor portal, the woman's gratitude gentle, earnest wrapped around Marian like a soft blanket. Purpose settled into her bones in a way she hadn't felt in years. But purpose didn't erase the shadows. When the day ended and the skies outside bruised into twilight, she sat alone at her new desk, staring at the small stack of notes she'd written for herself, for the seniors, for the programs she hoped to build. Each note felt like a seed she wasn't afraid to plant. Her phone rang once, a call. She didn't recognize the number. When she answered, a receptionist from the nonprofit's main office asked a simple administrative question. Nothing more. Still. When she hung up, a thought drifted through her uninvited, softer than regret. Would Ethan call someday? And if he did, would she answer? She didn't like the way her chest tightened. She turned off her lamp, ready to leave, when she noticed another email waiting, from him, this one even simpler. Thought you might appreciate this article. It reminded me of the work you're doing now. Hope the day treated you kindly. A link followed something about digital empowerment for older adults. For a moment, she simply studied his words. There was restraint in them, respect, a carefulness she'd begged for once and never received. Her finger hovered above the screen. She read the message again, and slowly, almost against her own will, her lips curved. It wasn't a big smile. It wouldn't have been visible to anyone else, but she felt it. The way a closed room feels the first draft of fresh air. She closed the email and held the phone against her chest. Could forgiveness grow from something this small she didn't know? Could trust rebuild itself at this pace, quiet, steady, unforced? She didn't know that either. But as she stepped outside and felt the evening breeze lift strands of her hair, her heart loosened just enough for a single thought to slip through. Not everything lost is gone forever. She locked the door behind her and walked toward her car, the faint smile lingering, refusing to fade just yet. She saw him before he saw her sitting in the back row, shoulders slightly hunched, chin lowered as if he didn't want to take up more space than he deserved. Humility softened the sharp lines of his posture, and for a moment, Marian simply watched him. Letting the realization settle, people really could change, if life pushed them hard enough. The community room buzzed gently around her. Seniors chatted with volunteers, folding pamphlets, comparing notes, practicing what they'd learned. Laughter rose in warm pockets. Someone turned on a portable speaker with old Motown songs, and a few attendees swayed lightly with the rhythm. It was the nonprofit's first spring event, a celebration of resilience, of learning late in life, of small victories, the kind of gathering that warmed the air even more than the season did. Marian had been greeting attendees for almost an hour when she spotted him. Ethan, dressed simply in a dark sweater instead of the tailored suits he used to wear like armor, sat apart from the bustle. He was listening to an elderly man who spoke animatedly with his hands. Every so often, Ethan nodded attentive, patient. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but whatever it was made the old man smile broadly. It tugged at her chest in a way she wasn't sure she was ready for. When the program ended and volunteers began tidying the room, Ethan stood, quietly stacking chairs without being asked. It looked almost strange to see him do something so ordinary, so unguarded. But it wasn't the kind of strangeness that pushed her away. It was the kind that made her pause in the doorway. Fingers curled around a folder, breath caught between gratitude and uncertainty. He didn't notice her until he finished the last chair in the stack. When he straightened and turned, their eyes met. He stopped, Not out of fear, not out of guilt, just out of respect. He didn't move closer. He didn't say her name. He simply waited. She approached him slowly, the folder still in her hands. "Hi, Ethan," she said softly. He exhaled, the sound nearly invisible, but she felt its weight. "Hi, Marian." No tension, no edge, just two adults standing in the kind of silence that didn't cut it, healed. "Thank you for coming today," she said. "I wanted to support the work," he replied. "It's important. And you're good at it." She nodded, her eyes lowering for a moment. Compliments from him used to feel like crumbs tossed from a high table. Today, they felt grounded, earnest. When she looked up again, her voice was quieter. "Do you have a few minutes? I'd like to walk a bit, clear my mind after the event?" He blinked once, surprised, but careful not to show too much. "Of course. If you want company." She did. More than she'd expected. They stepped outside into the early spring dusk. The sky was painted with thin strokes of lavender and peach, the kind of colors that softened even the hardest edges of a long day. A breeze carried the smell of damp earth and budding trees. They fell into step naturally, neither leading nor following. "I've been thinking a lot," Marian began, her voice steady but thoughtful. "About choices, about the version of myself I want to grow into." Ethan listened, hands in his pockets, gaze lowered to the path ahead. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'm not asking you to change course for me. He drew a slow breath. "I wanted you to know I'm still trying to understand the places where I failed you." She didn't interrupt. She let him speak at his own pace. "I was blind to how much space I took up," he continued, "how much I expected without giving anything back. I thought I was protecting both of us by keeping things unspoken, but I think I was only protecting myself from needing someone." His words brushed against an old bruise, but not painfully this time. "And now," she asked, "and now I'm trying to learn what it means to show up for someone without hiding behind work or pride." His voice grew rougher but stayed low. "I don't expect anything from you, Marian. Not forgiveness, not a second chance. I just want to be better than the man you had to walk away from." They reached a quiet stretch of the path where soft yellow streetlights glowed through young leaves. Their steps slowed without either of them noticing. She looked at him then, really looked at the man who had once terrified himself more than he ever frightened her. At the man who had broken something between them without even realizing it. At the man trying, piece by piece, to rebuild himself without demanding she stand by for the reconstruction. "Ethan," she said gently, "I'm not looking backward, not anymore. I'm trying to understand what feels right now and what could feel right next." He didn't speak, didn't push, just waited the way he had been waiting for months, not for her love, but for her clarity. They continued walking, the night slowly deepening around them. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a car engine hummed past. The world was unhurried. Then, without planning to, without thinking too hard, Marian reached out and touched his arm. It was small, barely more than a moment, but he felt it all the way to his breath. She left her hand there just long enough for him to feel the warmth, and the permission, and the quiet beginning folded inside the gesture. When she withdrew, she didn't speak, and he didn't dare assume. But the air between them shifted, filling with something that wasn't quite forgiveness, and wasn't quite distance, but lived tenderly in the space between, a different kind of beginning. Maybe. They didn't rush for once. Time felt less like something slipping through their fingers and more like an ally, patient and steady. Weeks passed in soft, deliberate steps, nothing grand, nothing dramatic, just two people showing up in small ways, stitching together a connection that had frayed quietly over years. It began with coffee. Marian found an extra cup waiting on her desk one morning at the nonprofit her favorite roast. Just the right amount of milk. No note, no assumption he would stay. Ethan had simply left it with the receptionist and walked away, choosing not to intrude. She learned about it only when she stepped into the lobby and caught him heading for the door. his hands tucked in his coat pockets. Posture humble. "Thank you," she said. He'd paused, turned slightly, and gave a small nod. "You're welcome." They hadn't lingered, but something eased between them, like fog thinning. Another week later, after one of her afternoon classes ended, she was surprised to find him sitting on a bench outside, listening to a senior talk about her first successful online grocery order. Ethan wasn't there for Marian, at least not entirely. He was there to understand the world she had chosen, to see it with his own eyes, to appreciate it, not judge it. And she noticed that he laughed, really laughed, when the woman teased him about being too handsome to look so serious all the time. Marian had walked over, smiling softly. "You're becoming part of the community." "I see." He shrugged lightly. "They don't care about my title. It's refreshing." She could hear the truth in that. Their walks continued, always unhurried. Sometimes they talked about work, sometimes about the weather. Other times about childhood memories, his father, teaching him how to fix a fence in the cold. Her mother humming old folk songs while stirring soup on Sunday evenings. One evening, as they walked past a small park where children were swinging under fading daylight, Ethan slowed. "I'm working with someone," he said quietly. She glanced over. "A therapist?" He nodded. "I realized I needed help understanding why I shut people out, why I worked to avoid depending on anyone." He was silent for a moment. "I thought I was being strong. Turns out it was fear." The honesty tightened her chest. She didn't reward him with instant forgiveness. She'd learned not to rush, but she acknowledged his courage with a small, grateful look. In return, she shared her own struggle. "I'm learning to set boundaries, to not disappear into someone else's life." She drew a slow breath. "Even yours." He accepted that without defensiveness. "I want you to keep those boundaries, even if they mean I get less of your time." She didn't expect that. The version of him she had known for 6 years would have tightened his grip, even unknowingly. This version gave her space and meant it. Here and there, he slipped. A late-night message he shouldn't have sent. A moment of jealousy he caught too late. But each time, he paused, apologized, corrected himself, not perfectly, not instantly, but earnestly. Their connection grew in the steady way of mature love through consistency, not sparks, through long conversations over half-finished mugs of tea at her kitchen table, through quiet confessions at dusk, when the world softened and allowed honesty to breathe. One late afternoon, they sat across from each other in that kitchen, light from the window settling into a warm gold. The day had been long for both of them, but in that small space, the weight of everything felt lighter. Marian stirred the last of her tea absent-mindedly, watching the swirl. "Do you ever miss your old life?" she asked. Ethan looked at the table, thinking. Parts of it, he admitted. The sense of control, the certainty. But most of that certainty was built on distance. And distance isn't something I want anymore. She listened quietly. "What about you?" he asked. She exhaled slowly. "I don't miss being invisible." His breath caught, the regret clear on his features. "You were never invisible to me, Marian. I just—" He stopped, searching for the right words. "I didn't know how to look the right way." It wasn't a perfect sentence, but it was true. A peaceful quiet settled between them, not heavy, not charged, simply present, the kind of quiet that made the heart attentive. Ethan's hands rested on the table, fingers lightly interlaced. He wasn't fidgeting. He wasn't forcing courage. He simply looked at her with a steadiness that felt different from the man she once worked for. "Marian," he said, voice low but steady. "May I ask you something?" Her pulse fluttered, though her face remained calm. "Go ahead." He took a breath, grounding himself. "May I try again? With you? The right way this time. As two people choosing each other, not out of habit, not out of fear, but because it feels right." The words hovered in the fading light, fragile and full. Marian didn't answer right away. She looked down at her mug, tracing the rim with her thumb. Her throat tightened, not with sadness, but with the weight of what choosing him again would mean. She thought of how hard she'd worked to rebuild herself, how much steadier she'd become, how much he'd changed, how much they still needed to untangle. She lifted her eyes at last, the softest tremor in her breath, and just as she opened her mouth to speak, a hush overtook the room, gentle, expectant, tender as the pause before a first step taken together. Her answer hovered there, unspoken, suspended on the edge of something fragile and new. She didn't answer right away. She simply looked at him, long enough for him to fear the worst. The kitchen seemed to hold its breath around them, the late afternoon light softening into amber across the table. Ethan stayed still, his hands open, unguarded, waiting for a truth that could either steady his world or undo it all over again. Marian drew in a slow breath. Her eyes weren't cold. They weren't angry. They were searching, as though she needed to see the man in front of her without the noise of memory, without the shadows of the years that had tangled them so tightly together. Finally, she set her mug down, the gentle click landing like a quiet declaration. "I'm not looking for a pedestal," she said softly, "or a rescue. And I'm not looking to go back to being someone's support beam while they stand in the spotlight alone." His throat tightened. "I understand." She shook her head, the faintest hint of a sad smile touching her lips. "No, not understand, agree." She let her gaze settle on his. "If we try again, I need to know you see me as a partner, not an extension of your schedule or your grief. A real partner, someone with her own life, her own dreams, her own boundaries." Ethan swallowed, his voice steady but low. "I do agree, completely." She studied him for another heartbeat, as if testing the truth of his words in the stillness between them. And then finally her expression softened into something warm, quiet, and unmistakably hopeful. In that case, her voice dropped ever so slightly, a tremor of vulnerability in it. Yes. It was not loud, not dramatic, not a scene ripped from the movies, but to Ethan, it felt like the world had just exhaled after holding tension for far too long. He breathed out, shoulders falling in relief as a soft laugh escaped him, half joy, half disbelief. "You're sure?" Marian nodded. "I'm sure." Then she added, "But this time, we go slowly." And honestly, her gaze held his, steady and clear. "If we do this, it has to be real." He leaned forward, voice warm. "Real is all I want." They didn't touch right away. They let the moment sit between them like a fragile promise, letting it sink in, letting it settle. It felt right. Two adults choosing not to rush toward the ending, but to honor the beginning. When they finally stood, it wasn't some grand embrace. Ethan reached for her hand gently, almost asking permission with his touch. Marian let her fingers thread through his, deliberate and sure. The contact was warm, grounded, and more intimate than anything loud could have been. "Ready?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "I think so." They stepped out of her townhouse into the warm evening air. The sky had shifted into shades of soft gold and rose, the kind of gentle spring dusk that made Chicago feel tender instead of harsh. The scent of budding trees drifted through the breeze as they walked down the steps and onto the sidewalk together. Their hands remained intertwined, simple, human, real. Not a show for anyone. Just a quiet truth between them. As they walked, Ethan glanced at her, taking in the calm strength in her posture, the peacefulness in her eyes. It was new, not the Marian he had leaned on, not the Marian he had taken for granted in his blind spots. This Marian stood beside him, not behind. "I thought I lost you forever," he murmured. It slipped out, unpolished, raw. He didn't try to hide how close he had come to breaking open. Marian stopped walking, turning toward him. She reached up and touched his cheek gently, her thumb brushing the faint stubble along his jawline. Her touch held no hesitation. "Not forever," she said, "just long enough for both of us to grow." The words landed between them like a soft, warm truth, the kind that didn't demand explanation. The kind that didn't erase the past, but transformed it. Ethan felt something inside him shift in understanding, a gratitude, a quiet awe that she had chosen him again, but not blindly, not out of habit, out of clarity, out of strength. They continued walking toward the small cafe at the end of the block, the one she loved for its quiet evenings and warm wooden booths. When they stepped inside, the light clink of silverware and distant hum of conversation wrapped around them. No one turned to stare. They weren't a spectacle. They were just two people finding their way back to each other. Marian slid into a booth, and Ethan sat across from her. But he didn't stay there long. After a moment, he stood and moved to her side of the booth, sitting beside her instead, close enough to share warmth, far enough to respect her space. She didn't object. In fact, she leaned a little toward him, her shoulder brushing his arm, small but unmistakably intentional. "This feels different," she said quietly. He nodded. "Because we're different." A soft silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that held room to breathe, room to grow, room for a midlife love that didn't need fireworks to be real. After they finished their coffees, they walked back out into the fading light. Their joined hands cast a long, gentle shadow on the pavement behind them. As they reached her door again, they paused, not with uncertainty, with presence. "What does love look like at our age?" Ethan asked softly, almost to himself. Marian smiled, warm and thoughtful. "I think we get to decide." She didn't offer an answer, not a final one. Instead, she squeezed his hand, a promise waiting to be written, slow and steady. And as they stood there in the quiet evening glow, it became clear that this wasn't an ending. It wasn't even a complete beginning. It was a doorway open, patient, full of possibility. The kind of love that didn't rush, didn't demand, didn't pretend. The kind of love that grows one honest step at a time. Sometimes, healing begins in the quiet places we've avoided for years, the pauses between words, the honesty we finally allow ourselves to speak. What their story reminds us is that love in midlife isn't about grand declarations or dramatic rescues. It's about choosing to show up with all the pieces of who we are, even the ones we've kept hidden. It's the courage to say, "I was wrong," and the grace to hear, "I need time." And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let someone walk away long enough for both hearts to grow in the direction of truth. It also teaches us that being needed is not the same as being seen. We can spend years holding everything together for someone else and forget that our own life deserves space, too. When we step toward the things that give us meaning, the right people, the ones who truly value us, gently find their way back. May this leave you with a small warmth. It is never too late to love differently, to try again, or to choose the version of yourself that finally feels whole. Thank you, truly, for spending a little of your time with this story. Your presence here matters more than you know. It's what keeps these gentle, human moments alive. If you feel this tale brought you something warm or meaningful, a simple like share or subscribe is a quiet way to help these kinds of stories reach someone else who might need them. Wishing you peace, softness, and a good evening wherever you are.